for day 2. So let's launch in. So good afternoon. I am Meaghan McDonald. I'm a senior advisor here with the National Network. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our panel this afternoon on government and violence prevention, evidence-based violence prevention. And so we spent the past 2 days talking about the emerging science of violence prevention, acknowledging how far we've come, and that it feels like this is the moment to be talking about establishing this as a field of practice. One of the ways in which establishing this body of work as a field would help us all is that it's often not taken seriously and sufficiently supported by government. And success in various places often is occurring despite that lack of support at the city or the state level. So for example, many cities lack some sort of centralized place where this work operates, like an Office of Violence Prevention. Some of you may have had an opportunity yesterday to sit in on the panel that discussed that, to hear about a handful of cities where that's not the case any longer, but in some of those places only very recently that's true. Similarly, there are very few examples of state-level funding for violence prevention work. And more often than not, those that are tasked with doing this really important work are doing it without that kind of infrastructure and support. And any sort of accountability structures that are in place are really informal at best. And so this afternoon, I'm really excited to be joined here by this panel because they're going to tell you all the ways in which they have made exceptions to these facts and norms in our field. They and their organizations are charting the course for the rest of us, and my hope for this afternoon is that we can all learn from them and hear about ways in which you can take ideas and lessons learned from their approach back to your communities where you're doing the amazing work that you're all involved with. And additionally, I think the conversations we've been having together over the past couple of days will hopefully continue to push the needle so that supporting, sustaining, holding accountable this work is going to not be the exception, but what's expected. So I think with that, I'm going to just stick to really brief introductions and let us hear directly from the panelists. So I'll start here. To my left is Michael Green, who is the Executive Deputy Commissioner for the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, or DCJS. Next, we have Trisha Stein, who snuck her way onto the panel, despite her name being Trisha.
Don't say my middle name.
Trisha Michael Stein is the Director of Administrative Operations for the Detroit Police Department. One of her top initiatives is to oversee Ceasefire Detroit. Next, we have Mike McLively, who is the Urban Gun Violence Initiative Director for the Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And last but not least, we have Michael Sean Spence, who is the Director of Policy and Implementation for Everytown for Gun Safety. And so I'm going to just get us started and pose to each of the panelists a question. I'd love for you to take some time to just further introduce yourselves and your work, and particularly what it means to each of you to have government support for evidence-based violence prevention and what that means in particular to your work, to your experience. And we'll start, I think, Trisha, with you.
The non-mic will go first. All right. Excellent. Well, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us after lunch and surviving that. We're going to try to keep it really entertaining. Meaghan and the mics, and I don't know, we're going to do a skit later. So just to give a little bit of context from Detroit, I know that you've probably heard a lot about it in the news, but we did have the largest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States in 2013. We had a lot that got us there, a lot of steps that got us there, and had a lot of turmoil. We had 4 mayors in 4 years. We had 5 police chiefs in 4 years. So a lot of turnover, a lot of instability. Our police force went down by almost 30%. Our population went down by just about that same amount. The tax base, the revenue sharing, something that Mike and I were talking about at lunch today, really got us into a pretty rough spot, manufacturing the economic downturn. So come 2013, our police chief comes to Detroit. Come 2013, our mayor gets elected. He starts in January 2014, really trying to get a little bit of arms around things, drinking straight out of the fire hose. I started in January 14 with the mayor's office and then moved over to the police department in 2015. We're coming out of bankruptcy in 2015, and that's when the chief and the mayor really start taking a notice on ceasefire. And they were crystal clear. They didn't think it worked. They didn't buy into the model, and they didn't think it worked. And so they had two choices. Either going to lean in hard and take it over, or it was something we weren't going to do. So they decided in the summer that it was going to lean in hard, take it over. We really call the summer of 2015 a hard reset. That's really how we gauged our ceasefire work, and you'll hear a lot of us talk about before 2015 and after. The DOJ grant for ceasefire started, we got it like a lot of other cities that you've heard about in 2012. We started the work in 2013, but it was really the 2015 work that we leaned in and then really started to build a balanced approach. So it's prevention, intervention, and enforcement, and it's a three-pronged stool, and really try to add capacity, leverage resources, and be able to build a model that's based on evidence-based and are intentional about our work. So if I could just take a couple more minutes to talk about our work, and a lot of my team is here, so I'll give them a few shout-outs, and maybe they'll help me answer questions here in a little while. And so we have a full prevention and intervention side. We have one community organizer who oversees all of our outreach workers. We have 5 outreach workers. We have a social worker who does all of our intake, and he vets all of the folks from the call-ins, from custom notifications, from referrals. We have 2 resource counselors. These are added capacity that we just brought on because a lot of our outreach workers were doing case management. So they're really good at street outreach. They're really good at validating and responding to scenes and hospitals and doing stopping retaliation. But casework, not really their strong suit. They were doing it, though. So then we added a capacity for resource counselors and to connect folks to the resources in the community and help to fill that. We have a faith-based coordinator who has about 24 churches who actively engage in our coalition work, and then it's probably 100+ police chaplains that are part of our police department, and that's an added capacity for the work that really balances out the prevention and intervention side. They, as I said, respond to shooting scenes when it's group involved, help retaliation. They've got their side, police got their side, try to bridge and help calm the scene. They respond to hospitals. They do street outreach and engagement with our precincts in areas. They've been doing all sorts of creative things. I just signed off on to get the lawn mowed. They want to have a picnic next week in front of a house that's really driving up violence, and they thought that doing some street engagement and showing the community and the police together in an area that's really spiking would be a good way to build community, and it's paid off. This is on the west side. It's paid off on the east side. It's a huge divide in Detroit. I'm a west sider. Don't ask me anything about the east side. So vice versa. And then we have a whole support and outreach wraparound services. It's anchored by Flip the Script with Goodwill, and then we've got a mental health provider that does group services, and the mayor's task force on workforce development has DOL dollars that are leveraged and help with job placement, and that's really how we leverage it. And then the enforcement side is local, state, federal partners all coming together. The chief is a leader in our violence prevention efforts. He is the top law enforcement officer. He is a strong believer in community policing, and this is his model. He strongly believes in it. He feels really good about it. He's seen it in places where it's worked and it hasn't worked. He's not shy about saying it didn't work in Detroit when he got there, but he feels really good about the work that we're doing now. And with the mayor's buy-in, we continually add resources. We have 2 to 3 disruption crews in each of our precincts. We're in 9 of 11 precincts. It's an overlay of our strategy in the Detroit Police Department, this balanced approach of focused deterrence and working with community outreach, doing law enforcement, doing pulling levers, and keeping promises. And then we work with our U.S. Attorney's Office do federal indictments. We've had a leadership change in these last, since the hard reset, if you will, and we haven't missed a beat. We've got a new U.S. attorney. He came in a little skeptical in March of 2018, came to his first call and said, I'm not so sure about this, but he did it, and then now he's all in. In fact, he led an effort that two of our members were able to participate in on Monday. They had a small group luncheon, the U.S. attorney, the chief, and the mayor with some former call-in participants, and really wanted to hear from them what worked, what didn't work, what do they think should change, did they take services, have they had any contact with the police since, and really did a whole after-action review that in the police that we're used to, but it was really driven by our U.S. attorney. So the buy-in is huge from the top, from our leadership. They never miss a call-in. Our mayor's missed one call-in, and that was because he had to be in Washington, D.C. to meet with the Vice President of the United States to get us some money for our transportation system. But other than that, he will never miss a call-in. And then lastly is money, because I don't ever want to be distracted about money. So our DOJ grant ended September 2018. It was $2.1 million that we had over 5 years. And then the city, for the first time, put in some money starting in October. It was money that was negotiated out of bankruptcy. I don't recommend anybody trying to do that, but to get the money. However, because we were able to do that in the current fiscal year that we're in, that will end next week, starting July 1, they've doubled that money, so we have $700,000 city dollars that are baked in to the line item of the police department for prevention work. That will be next fiscal year, and then we continue to leverage dollars and get more money and try to build the work.
Great, thank you for that. And for those in the room who are doing this work or trying to do this work and feel envious, I think we need to underline the point that this is not where Detroit started 5 or 6 years ago, and we can continue to pull out sort of how we got there. So don't be discouraged. I'll pass it next to you, Mike.
Thanks, Meaghan. It's tough to follow. So I'll give you a little bit of history because I think that's important in terms of the way I approach what I'm doing now. But I spent 25 years as a prosecutor in Rochester, New York. Spent about 22 years prosecuting homicide cases, probably about 11 years going out to the scene of almost every homicide that we had. And it was about 40 or 50 a year at that time. And I was very good at what I did in terms of prosecuting. But there was one moment in particular I remember, and I just finished prosecuting a fairly high-profile case, and it was one young man who shot and killed another young man, and the courtroom was just packed with two families. On one side of the courtroom was the family of the young man who had been killed, and the other side of the courtroom was the family of the young man who had just been convicted and was now facing a 25-year-to-life sentence as, I think, an 18-year-old at the time. And I walked out of court, and there was a lot of press there, and all the press gathered around and the cameras. And one of the reporters asked me, "Are you happy?" And I just thought for a minute, and I thought, what a bizarre question. And, I felt the right thing had happened. I didn't have any doubt in my mind that the one young man had intentionally shot and killed the other young man. And in that sense, that was justice. But I didn't see anything to be happy about in that moment. Neither family, felt, any comfort at that moment in time. There was, everyone was upset and crying and screaming. And so I think that, in a lot of ways really colored the way I look at this work now. And the other thing, the 11 years of going out to scenes and 22 years of prosecuting cases, I can't tell you how many living rooms and, dining rooms and kitchens I sat in with victims' families. And, I'm fortunate never to have had a family member of mine killed, but I became very close to a lot of the families. Just for example, one of the victims' mothers, a woman named Audrey Smith, wound up wanting to do something with her grief and founded an organization called Families and Friends of Murdered Children. And I was close with her, and helped her with that organization. We stayed close for 25 years until she died. And, she would refer to me as her adopted son. So you form these bonds or these relationships, but those 22 years really influenced my thinking in terms of, how we should be approaching this work. And so little over 7 years ago, I came to the Division of Criminal Justice Services in a very different role. We weren't prosecuting anymore, but we had control over funding streams, and we do about $200 million of grant funding every year across the state of New York. And the question was, for me, how could we best use that money, and how could I best use the position I was in, and how could we as an agency best use our position to help make sure that we weren't just chasing after what had happened, that we were trying to be proactive, that we were trying to incentivize the type of work that doesn't respond to these events, but the type of work that will help prevent the events. And so over the course of that 7 years, with the help of a great staff, we've been able to take all of I would say probably all of those funding streams and really align them with evidence-based work. So when we look at gun violence, we took a funding stream that in the past allowed jurisdictions to make up any plan they wanted, and then we would give them funding to carry it out, whether there was evidence to indicate it worked or not. And we transformed that into a funding stream focusing on gun violence, where we said we are only going to support plans that incorporate evidence-based work, including things like GVI. In the street outreach area, we've built a program of 11 different street outreach programs across the state, and we don't want to just pass money along. We want to help provide a structure for those programs. So 11 different programs don't have to figure out how to train their people, and how to keep records and how to do all, that we can provide that structure for them. So in addition to the funding we provide, we create that structure and help support the work in that way. So I guess, for me, there's really two reasons, one far more compelling than the other. But the first one was just, as a taxpayer, I felt, and I tell this to the people in my organization, the taxpayers are entrusting us with $200 million and saying, go use this to try and make our community safer. And we've got an obligation to use that money in the most effective way possible. But more importantly, from a human perspective, all of the heartbreak and the anguish and the grief that I saw and the devastation, and we are in a platform and in a position where we can do something about that. And as I look at it, we've got an obligation to do the best that we can to make sure that we're supporting work that's evidence-based, that's proven to be effective, that's going to make the biggest difference in the communities across the state. So we've really tried to use our position, in terms of the funding and the support that we can provide to drive work that will make be most effective in terms of reducing shootings, reducing violence.
Mike McLively, Michael, Sean Spence, go ahead.
Yes. Well, it's great to be amongst family, and I say that because I have a number of current colleagues as well as former colleagues here, and I want to acknowledge all of them. So I'm a former special assistant at DCJS under Mike Green, as was mentioned, current director of policy implementation at Everytown, but before that, I was a prosecutor in Queens. And that's where I came to the issue of gun violence. Within the first 3 months of becoming a prosecutor 12 years ago, I was assigned as precinct counsel to NYPD's 113th precinct. As some of you may be aware, that's where Sean Bell was killed that same year. So I was able to represent the DA's office and be that voice for many of the survivors and those directly impacted by the violence, being able to serve as a conduit for them, going back to the DA and communicating how they were experiencing that violence on the ground. Fast forward, all of those experiences I mentioned, now at Everytown, and I now play a role alongside my colleagues in spearheading this new approach to city gun violence, everyday violence as I call it. Part of that role is supporting non-legislative strategies that we know are proven to work, that are evidence-based, that reduce the violence and that save lives. We're talking about group violence intervention. We're also talking about crime prevention through environmental design. We're talking about hospital-based violence intervention programs. We're talking about a number of theories and approaches that have been academically reviewed and vetted, and that a number of groups are already implementing with great success at the local level. A large part of our role is not just supporting those strategies, but one, identifying them, elevating them, as well as finding mechanisms by which we can support and sustain those efforts, okay? We do this in a number of ways. One is our City Gun Violence Initiative, which we founded last year, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But in addition to that, we're working directly with governmental agencies to make sure they are effectively implementing new laws that we know work. We're talking about extreme risk protection order laws. We're talking about domestic violence restraining orders. We're also working directly with local gun violence prevention groups to identify other strategies that might be suitable for their communities, that leverage their local needs and resources and acknowledge the work they've already been doing, the gaps they've identified, and the resources they are requesting. Additionally, we're making sure that the laws that are on the books that we know work are being properly enforced. We're making sure that law enforcement have the tools and the strategies necessary to identify straw purchasers, traffickers of firearms, things of that nature. That we can also assist them in ensuring that prohibited individuals, such as domestic violence abusers, subject to protective orders, are not able to then access a firearm. Additionally, we're training our membership, of which we have approximately 2 million moms throughout the nation in every state. About 250,000 are active day to day, and we're training them to go into the courtrooms and watch these cases, watch these judges to ensure that they are ordering relinquishment when necessary by statute or when it's appropriate via discretion. We're already doing that in Providence, Rhode Island. We're expanding next week to Nashville. We're going to be going to Pittsburgh. We're hitting Minneapolis, and we're going to keep hitting cities until what we know is right is happening. City Gun Violence Initiative. So let's talk about that for a second. We have a three-prong approach, and Sharon, please raise your hand, because this is who you should ask questions of. This is our City Gun Violence Manager. She leads this effort and has been doing a bang-up job. We'll also talk more about that later. But we have a three-prong approach. One, like I mentioned, identifying those groups, those strategies, elevating and centering the voices of survivors, making sure every strategy we work to support or implement is locally informed as well as locally driven, and then supporting. Now we can put some meat on the bones. We're talking about state funding, like the example Mike shared. We're talking about city appropriations, which also work. We're talking about public-private partnerships, which we're starting to endeavor to develop, as well as direct funding supports. An example of that is we went through a very intentional process led by Sharon to identify groups across the nation that were in the disproportionately impacted communities that were also implementing these evidence-based strategies that needed more resources, and we decided to directly support them, providing resources, technical assistance, peer convenings, and we're going to have our first annual convening in August. So these are a couple of the tenets of our approach. It's incredibly important to Everytown. For those of you who are familiar with us, we've evolved a great deal over the last 5 years of our existence. We started in 2014, really trying to get some good gun laws passed. Then we evolved and added a litigation group to defend and support those cities that are able to pass good gun laws and to fight against the bad gun laws that were being passed at the local level. And last year we evolved to develop my group to lead our efforts in cities.
Should I go for it? All right, good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing? Hanging in. My name is Mike McLively. I'm a senior staff attorney at Giffords Law Center. Like Michael Sean, I work at a national gun violence prevention organization named for former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. So just quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with Gabby? All right, almost all of us. So yeah, most people have heard her story. She was shot in the head at an event she was holding in Tucson, Arizona in 2011. And formed a national gun violence prevention organization that merged with my group. I'm based in San Francisco. That was the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. We're now the Giffords Law Center. And Gabby's shooting was actually one of the events that affected me personally and got me involved in the movement. So I'm proud to say that I now report directly to Gabby Giffords as my boss. For purposes of this conversation, I want us to sort of flash backwards 4 years ago. And our movement, this National Gun Violence Prevention Movement, was talking about how to address gun violence exclusively through regulating guns. And obviously that is an important part of the equation, and our country is not doing nearly enough when it comes to regulating guns. But what I found when I arrived at the organization was that was the only solution we were talking about. And I happened to have had the fortune of reading David Kennedy's book, Don't Shoot, before I arrived at the organization, and knew there were strategies out there that had to do not just with regulating guns, but with working directly with high-risk people, intervening person to person, and that there was strong evidence out there that this would have an incredible effect on rates of violence in impacted communities. And so I won't go into all the details, but long story short, the fact that I'm here and that Michael Sean is here, I think is evidence of the evolution that our movement has gone through. And we've realized that there are groups out there, like many of you, who've been doing this work for many, many years, and that there was a role for us to play in supporting that work, into talking to politicians about it, into communicating with reports to the rest of our movement, frankly, to educate them about what are these strategies. So we released a report when we first started doing this work, now back in 2016, called Healing Communities, and essentially identified some of the most promising strategies for reducing violence outside of regulating guns. And so we lifted up group violence intervention, relationship-based street outreach work, hospital-based violence intervention, and then coordinating all those through a centralized city agency as some of the most promising practices. And when we did this, what we saw was these things are happening in pockets around the country and in many places with great success, but they haven't necessarily been scaled up across the city or scaled up to all the places they need to be the most effective. And the number one thing we were hearing from people was resources, right? We are not getting the funding that we need to do this work. And so one of the first things we did was set out to map what does state funding for this type of work look like in all 50 states in our country. And what we found at the time, and there's only been a little bit of improvement on this, there are only 5 states in the entire country, and New York was one of them, that was investing what we would consider to be substantial amounts, like $1 million or more, in supporting this type of work at the local level. So our second report in this series was called Investing in Intervention, and identified those 5 states and took a deep dive into what does this look like in New York with Give and Snug as specific investments in these programs. What does it look like in Massachusetts, where they're investing in a completely non-law enforcement approach called the Safe and Successful Youth Initiative that's working directly with folks at highest risk of violence and then wrapping around services, employment opportunities, counseling, you name it, to help those folks get on a different path. And since then, we have used these reports to drive a policy agenda, which is that if a state is serious about addressing its gun violence epidemic, it has to not just improve its gun safety laws, it has to make a long-term, substantial investment in these strategies to make sure they get scaled up and have the support that they need to be in all neighborhoods that they need to be in. And so most recently, we took a deep dive into the city of Oakland, where I think a lot of this stuff is sort of coming together in terms of local funding, community activism to do this work, bringing together federal funding, and with pretty incredible results, right? So we just released this report a couple months ago called A Case Study in Hope, and the city of Oakland has had a 50% reduction in homicides and shootings since 2012. And there's a whole long story about why that happened. I encourage you to check out the report. It's available on our website at smartgunlaws.org. But a big part of it is sustained long-term funding. The city passed a ballot initiative back in 2004 called Measure Y that provided, now it's been increasing over time, but average, let's say, $20 million a year, 60% of which went to law enforcement, 40% went to community-based organizations. That was renewed again in 2014. And so we're talking about over years, hundreds of millions of dollars for the city of Oakland. And this is a city of 450,000 people, just for context. And that has really, this long-term investment has allowed an infrastructure to be created in the city of Oakland, really under the hub of Oakland Unite and Oakland Ceasefire, that are basically the social services and street outreach component of that, combined with a focused deterrence model that's been incredibly effective. And obviously this looks different in every city, but talking to the folks from Detroit, from New York, from wherever, there are very similar elements. And number one is just doing a problem analysis to understand who is that small population of people in our city that are driving the vast majority of shootings? And then reaching out to them, intervening with them, whether that's with human services, law enforcement, community, informal social control, whatever it is, interacting with those people. And that really is what drives the needle and moves the needle when it comes to reducing violence in our communities. And so with the release of this report and the other reports we've done, we're basically on now a policy agenda to get more states and more communities to find ways to fund this work. And I want to give just 2 quick examples, and then we'll get into questions and more comments. But one is the state of Florida, and I mentioned this in a question I had at the last panel, that after the Parkland shooting, the Florida legislature responded, and one of the things they did was invest $400 million into hardening schools, making schools safer. And if you've studied the data and you know the numbers on this issue, schools are relatively very safe places. Like, right, violence isn't happening in schools, it's happening in communities around schools. And that amount of money would have represented, had it been invested in the most impacted communities in Florida, the single largest, probably most meaningful investment in the history of our country, and instead went to responding sort of in a knee-jerk reaction to this crisis that had just happened, but in a way shows sort of how systems are set up to not respond to the needs of our most impacted communities. And so we're trying to change that narrative and to help people, and politicians in particular, understand there are strategies out there that have nothing to do with regulating guns, right? And so in our work, just because I don't know if everyone's familiar with the gun violence prevention movement, but so much of our work is about the Second Amendment and whether or not regulating guns violates individual rights. And there's a whole swath of our country that as soon as you bring up gun control or gun regulation, they don't want to have that conversation, and the door is essentially slammed in your face. Well, even with very conservative politicians, I think we can have a conversation about how much sense it makes to be investing our public dollars in these evidence-based and community-driven strategies, because there's a proven track record of how effective they are. And this is an important point, the problem of gun violence is incredibly expensive, and taxpayers are paying for this all over the place. So in a state like California, it's in the billions of dollars when you add up law enforcement costs, healthcare costs. Oftentimes for non-fatal shooting, people are dealing with the impact of that for the rest of their lives. And many times it's the public that's paying the price. So I don't care if you live in an impacted community or not, you are being impacted by gun violence, and you have to understand that. And our politicians have to understand that. You represent a rural community, fine, but you're still you're a state-level representative, and your constituents are paying a price, whether they know it or not. And so the return on investment for these programs and strategies is incredibly high, and I think the number one hurdle, we don't have to have this constitutional debate about regulating guns. We can just talk about, where are we going to find the resources and the political will to make this happen? And I think we've had great success in California that we'll talk about in a second, but just to sort of give you a hook on this, California had been investing $9 million a year, which in the state of California, our budget is $200 billion plus. So this is a drop in the bucket. And this year we've organized, and we've had in the past couple of years, this coalition that's based on improving that funding stream and increasing the amount of funding. And this year we've gotten the governor and legislature to get that number up to $30 million. So we're talking about $20 million additional dollars that are flowing specifically and directly to the most impacted communities in California for cities and community-based organizations to do effective violence intervention work. And we're trying to do that basically around the entire country, wherever it makes sense to do so. And so I'm excited to talk more about that work.
Yeah, and let's just stay on that while we're there. I don't know, Michael, Sean, Spence, if you want to layer it. Oh.
What was the name of that report?
It's called A Case Study in Hope. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. While we're on California, let's stay on that and hear a little bit more about how that came to be. I know that was an opportunity for the Giffords Law Center and for Everytown to collaborate. So if Michael, Sean, Spence, you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important to focus on why the effort was successful. And I thank Mike for pointing out that this was a continuous effort. This is something that those on the ground have been working to advocate for a while, and I'm happy that we were able to participate in a successful increase. A large part of why we were successful was, one, working in coalition, having an infrastructure to plug into, centering the campaign around those local voices. So Advance Peace, Youth Alive, Pico Live Free, Oakland Ceasefire, many of those local groups who have already been leading the charge on the ground and have been advocating for these funds. Working with them directly, as I mentioned before, to identify what their gaps were and how these additional resources could support and sustain their efforts, and then also working in concert through the coalition of both grassroots and grass tops. It wasn't just Everytown and Giffords, as well as those groups I just mentioned. It was a number of local mayors as well, a number of other local gun violence prevention groups. Allowing them not only to center our advocacy efforts, but then to lead them was a critical step. And then also, you know, I think a large part of this narrative is never stopping. About a month or so ago, we got to 27 million. And we kept advocating. after a 3 times increase, we said there is more that can be done. We kept pointing to the impact that was being experienced by the residents of California, the cost of gun violence, but then also we shared a comparative analysis. We pointed to New York. We pointed to other states that were doing this. Massachusetts investing $2 per capita. New York State, $1 per capita, leading the way, doing what's necessary and needed, and California got it. So I think a continued effort, the coalition work, having an existing infrastructure to plug into, having those local groups centered and leading the way were critical steps that allowed us to be successful. And we're going to continue going back to the well. 30 is great, but we know that there's more that we can get. So that's the fight for next year.
Right. Yeah.
And just to talk briefly about the funding for a minute, and I kind of take for granted that we have the funding available in New York, and then I come here and I hear some of the other states and the struggles. We're fortunate to have a governor who's really invested and has given us the resources to invest. And we spend about $13.5 million a year on our gun-involved violence elimination, supporting things like GVI. We invest about $7.5 million a year in our street outreach programs. We invest about $8 million a year in crime analysis centers to provide the analysis and the data to do this kind of work in a very targeted, focused way. And then in addition, we provide millions of dollars in salaries for people who are the training director or the coordinator for our SNUG program or run the social work piece of the SNUG program. We pay for technical assistance and training from the National Network for Safe Communities, for folks like Craig Yoshida or George Mason and the Center for Evidence-Based Policing, all at the state's expense. You add that up, that's easily over $30 million. And generally speaking, New York City, they have their own street outreach programs. You heard Commissioner Tucker talk about the work they're doing. So most of our work is going to the non-New York City community. So, you look at New York State, 19 million people, 7 or 8 million people in New York. So about 11 million people in the rest of the state. That's over $30 million in investment for, roughly 11 million people. So very significant investment, which is helpful. But then, making sure that we're using that in a targeted way to try and get the most out of it. And if you look at the results, too, I think this doesn't get enough attention, but the last 2 years in New York, we had, 2 years ago, 547 homicides total. Not gun homicides, but total homicides. And then last year, 560. That's down from a high of 2,600 homicides. In the mid-90s, 2,600. The last 2 years, 547 and 560. So still a lot of work to do, but tremendous. There are cities that are, far smaller than New York that have more homicides than our entire state does, including New York City. So I think you could make a very strong case that the investment really does make a difference, and you can see the results of the investment if you do it right.
Just one thing to add really quickly on the California work and its implications for the rest of the country. So for people, whatever state you may be in, I heard it referenced multiple times yesterday that this is a movement, right, with a capital M. And a movement is good at bringing in more and more people into the tent, right, and people with different skill sets and abilities. And I think for you to understand the gun violence prevention community that we represent is very good at a few things. One of them is political connections. For better or for worse, politicians reach out to us and say, what can we do to be addressing violence? I mean, they should be calling you guys directly, and hopefully they do. But for better or worse, politicians ask us, and we have their ear. And the other is communications. We have the ability to get messages out to a broad audience. And so I think that's the value add that we can bring to this movement is now that politicians are talking to us, we're not just saying, okay, well, are you doing universal background checks? Have you regulated large capacity ammunition magazines? Okay, well, you're done. You've done everything you need to do. Now the conversation is, if you are truly going to be a candidate who is a gun sense candidate that we're going to endorse, and our movement collectively spent tens of millions of dollars in the last election, so we have influence. To be a gun sense candidate, you have to say that it's a priority for you. If you're in a state that has any kind of city gun violence problem, to be investing in these types of solutions. And if you're not, we'll find a candidate who will. And eventually that is going to change, local, state, and I hope federal policy in a really meaningful way. And so I hope that's the value. And you saw it in California. I mean, you saw, and Moms Demand Action was an incredible example of this grassroots movement where people are in the dozens, knocking on doors of legislators and also meeting with them with practitioners, right? So sometimes for the first time, we had violence interrupters from Sacramento who were able to speak face-to-face to their representatives in a way that's so powerful. And you can see the legislators who haven't really understood this stuff, when it's explained to them by someone doing the work on the ground, they have this like aha moment. And they're like, oh, why haven't we been pouring millions of dollars into this all along? So I hope that gets across as like one takeaway from today, is that we are here to help with this. We're well connected, and we are more than happy to direct these resources to you, who we know do the work well and have been doing it for so long. And we're late to the party, which we apologize for, but here we are, and I hope that we can make the most of that. And whatever state you're in, please reach out and make connections with us and let us know how we can build these coalitions in other states and start to really unlock, I think, hundreds of millions of dollars is where we need to be getting in this country when you're looking at state and federal and really local investment in this.
Great. Okay. So I think I want to talk a little bit now about institutionalizing and sustaining and holding accountable the work, and come to you, Trisha. So you hold a very particular role in the city of Detroit that I think is influential when thinking about the success of Ceasefire in Detroit. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that came to be, and what it means for the work day to day?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a civilian director inside the police department. I'm appointed by the chief, but it was very intentional that I'm a civilian. The two directors before me were retired law enforcement, but the chief and the mayor and the U.S. attorney, it was a collaborative approach. I said no twice, and then the boysen and the big guns to the U.S. attorney at the time was Barbara Quaid, and so I didn't turn her down. But so they did approach and said, no, we really want it to be a civilian director, to do a balanced approach, to make sure it's focused deterrence, to be prevention, intervention, enforcement. And so there is a wraparound, and the model is based on evidence-based and has fidelity to it, and one isn't stronger than the other. So we've worked very hard since the 2015 reset. We've institutionalized it in our 40-hour block training at the police department. We have protocols for support and outreach that we share widely. They're living, breathing documents, and we update them, but we do have protocols. We have protocols for enforcement and integrate the work for support and outreach and enforcement. We've built capacity inside the police department. We've added social workers to our precincts. I don't think I mentioned those before. We also have crime analysts. This was thanks to Meaghan and the national network of doing a peer exchange, something we learned from Kansas City. So we have ceasefire crime analysts inside the precincts, inside our gang intel unit, who oversees on a citywide basis what groups are driving up the violence and who are the high impact players. But crime analysts that are dedicated to this work and share intelligence and be able to make sure that the product and the efforts are very focused and aren't just a blanket, but hopefully have specificity. And then to tie it all together, so because now we have all this attention and buy-in, we meet bi-weekly with the mayor and the chief, and they're dedicated to ceasefire, and it's similar to CompStat, and they both drive CompStat, and we have benchmarks that we have to report out on, both from an enforcement, prevention, and intervention, regular call-ins that I say that they participate in, and then also the mayor comes and monthly, meets with our whole command staff and really works in collaboration with our chief, and they're working on a violence prevention effort that they're getting ready to release. It was supposed to be today, but since so many of us are here today, they've pushed it back a few days. And so they are working together hand in hand to drive this and to then make sure that it sticks. We're on a historic low, as it's been talked about, but per capita wise, we're still 5 times the national average in violence and violent crime, and we're 7 times the national average in homicide. So we still have a lot of work to go. It's heading in the right direction. Since the hard reset, we've had a 25% reduction in homicides citywide. We've also had a 40% reduction in carjacking. And so, yeah, the mayor likes to sometimes be a little cheeky and say, well, it's not global warming, why this is going down. So we really do have to lean in and be intentional about the work.
Great, thanks. I think, so there was recently a transition in the police department, which is really common, right? The folks who are tasked with doing the work day to day do it so well that they get promoted, and this was a retirement, but it happens all the time. And, internally in our organization, we always talk about, what does this mean and what kind of work do we have to do to problem solve potentially or, help support. So we started having that conversation internally, and I was able to quickly say, it's not going to be a problem. This is not something that will be a blip on their radar because it's institutionalized and supported so intentionally from the top down, and it really shows. So I think next I'm going to come back to you, Mike Green, and to Mike. You guys can try to decipher which one based on my question. To talk a little bit, so of course the state provides a significant amount of funding to jurisdictions to do this work. Can you say a little bit about the role that DCJS plays in supporting and holding accountable the work that the jurisdictions are doing?
Sure, and I think it looks a little different depending on the particular funding stream or effort we're looking at, but GIVE, I think, is a good example. And 5 years ago, when we kicked GIVE off, we did a conference. We brought all 17 jurisdictions together. It's partnerships with the police chief, the DA, the sheriff, the probation department, community partners. And when we introduced GIVE and we introduced the concept that we were only going to support and fund evidence-based work, we didn't expect that a magic switch was going to be flipped and overnight everyone would just immediately transition to doing beautiful GVI work. We knew it would be a process. And we told all of the jurisdictions, each year when you apply, we're going to be looking at these applications. And there'll be leeway in year 1. And there'll be less leeway in year 2 and less in year 3. And by year 5, if you're not doing evidence-based work, don't expect to get funding. That we're not going to keep funding work that's not going to give us a return on our investment, that's not going to save lives. And that's always, it's easier to say than it is to stick to because there's always political considerations. You've got a place that has a significant homicide issue and you're going to zero them out on their funding because they're not, so we use a lot of different, it's incentivizing through funding, it's threatening the loss of funding. We have cut people's funding. We haven't eliminated anyone's funding, but we have made cuts because people aren't doing it. But in addition to that kind of, stick part of it, we're encouraging. We're constantly, Mike Wood and I will go visit a police chief, a DA, if they're struggling, or the staff, on a monthly basis, our staff is out, going to the GIVE meetings, working with the jurisdictions. We just put out our plans. Our jurisdictions submit their plans for the year. Our GIVE team went and personally visited every one of the 17 sites during that process to help them with the formulation of the plans. The National Network, among others, goes out and provides ceasefire universities or trainings across the state for us. So it's just continuous exposure. And not expecting that the first time you roll this out, it's going to be perfect, but looking at it as a process and how can you continue to move the ball forward. And, hopefully now we're better than we were, and I know we are, than we were 5 years ago. And next year will be better, and the year after will be better, and just so pushing that way. The SNUG work, we've taken a little different approach, and we've tried to use the structure, the state structure. So, where the GIVE program, a lot of it is driven locally, and we still provide support. SNUG, we have the statewide director, we have the training director, we now have the social work director, and we try and provide that hands-on support to guide and incentivize the programs, make sure they're running in the right direction. So, in different ways, we're constantly watching, we're staying in touch with our partners. We're not just a pass-through where we hand the money out, say this is what we want you to do with it and let go. We're trying to be a fully engaged partner looking to help at every step of the way. And we've been fortunate to engage, whether it's the folks at the National Network, whether it's people at George Mason Center for Evidence-Based Policing. We've engaged Craig Yoshida to help. We've engaged folks to help with SEPTED training. We've had lots of folks help us in different roles with the street outreach work we're doing. So a lot of, really knowledgeable. Tracy Mears has given us support. I could go on with the folks who've been willing to come in and help us out with this effort. And that translates into help for all of our local partners.
Great. So I think to pose to each of you, and you can decide which of you would like to go first, I would like to just spend a little bit of time hearing about where you're thinking, kind of what's on the horizon, what's next for your work, and Yeah, so why don't we start, actually, I'm going to direct you. Why don't we start with...
It's the moderator's choice.
Why don't we start with you, Michael, Sean, Spence, and work our way down?
No problem. So we have a lot on the horizon, as you probably suspect. The first step is the release of a website that we're currently developing and will be released in another month or so. This website is designed for mayors, local leaders. They will be able to filter based on unique factors from their communities, the sort of violence they're concerned about, the concentration of their population level, and find strategies recommended for communities like theirs. This will inform as well as advance the implementation of non-legislative strategies at the local level, and this will be a powerful tool for mayors once it's in their hands. Additionally, we're looking at additional mechanisms by which we can support this work. As many of you are already familiar, the Victim of Crime Act funds that the federal government disperses to every state and allows state administrators to then disperse to state, local governments, as well as non-governmental organizations like nonprofits, like many of you who are doing the work, is something that many are unaware of. And frequently, we learn that they don't even know how to even approach applying for these funds. Billions of dollars are left on the table in every state. We recently did a review of Missouri and found that $70 billion was left unspent. So we're working with these groups to identify streams like VOCA to apply, and in the months ahead, we're actually going to partner with 3 to 4 different localities to do a pilot where we actually assist them in the application process to hopefully draw down more of those funds. Additionally, we're going to continue our work in cities, remaining responsive. As was mentioned earlier by Mike, frequently decision makers do reach out to us. Unfortunately, it's usually following a tragedy. We recently heard from Trenton, Jacksonville regarding their recent spike. We've engaged with the Houston Mayor's Commission on Gun Violence to advise them on recommendations to make to the mayor. We're working closely with a number of other cities, Pittsburgh, one of them, just to advise and elevate these strategies we know work and help them identify mechanisms by which we can support them. And then lastly, we're going to further develop and train our membership. I'd be remiss if I didn't note regarding CalVIP that our moms generated hundreds of phone calls, emails, tweets directed at the governor, directed at legislators, which was also a large part of that strategy. But we're also informing them about how gun violence is being experienced in cities, how to engage with local groups, how to center their experiences and be respectful and acknowledge the history of violence as well as those systemic and structural factors that create the environments in which violence thrives. We could go on forever. But a large part of that is making sure they have the knowledge and the awareness so that when they're approaching this work, they're doing it in a manner that will lead to effectiveness, right? So that's a sample of what we're doing in cities. As I mentioned before, further expanding our court monitoring program, and that is how we help keep people accountable. And there will be a report based on those experiences. And then lastly, talking about gun sense candidates, next year's 2020. We've already started reaching out to candidates. We are engaging with every presidential candidate regardless of their odds. And we're making sure that they are aware of what works, what they need to be putting front and center, regardless of who wins. There's an opportunity to elevate these strategies, to make people more aware about the strategies that are evidence-based and that are effective, and utilizing their pulpit to leverage that awareness is an important strategy for us moving into 2020.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of that, a few candidates have already come out, and I think this is a really major development, with gun prevention platforms that include investing in evidence-based strategies as part of their platform. And that's a big deal. I don't think I've ever seen that before from any presidential candidate. And I think that's showing that we're breaking through with our messaging on this, that this has to be part of your platform to address violence in this country. Another, I think, really important and noteworthy development is coming out of Illinois, and we can't take any credit for this, but there's a push to legalize marijuana in Illinois, and advocates, I think really creatively, have been going to the folks involved with that and insisting that a percentage of that be broken off for violence reduction efforts and investing in communities that are most impacted by violence. like in Chicago, for example. So there is funding out there, and I think part of our mentality shift has to be away from this scarcity mentality, right? That there aren't enough resources. I think Florida, with its $400 million investment in hardening schools, is a great case in point. And I think Illinois shows us there are creative ways of finding new revenue. And then California shows us that you can take existing revenue streams like CalVIP, which originally was called CalGRIP and was all about preventing gangs and was very focused on gang activity. And we've moved it away from focusing on gangs and towards focusing on violence, right? Like the actual behavior that we want to address, which is violence. Not just gang membership on its own. And so I think it's much easier to adapt existing funding streams than it is to just create them out of the blue. That takes more political will. So I think one piece of advice for folks in states is to look out and see what might be in your state that's already out there that might be going towards maybe not evidence-based programming at the moment. And that's what we found in California. And maybe not to communities that are most in need. A lot of this money in California, as small as that budget was of $9 million, was being dispersed to communities that I would argue, didn't need the help nearly as much as others who were receiving no funding. And the work wasn't being tied to evidence-based work. So, they're having police officers go to middle schools and telling kids that it's bad to join a gang. Well, I would argue that's not the best, most strategic use of our resources. So I think taking a look out there in your state to see what exists and then creating some political pressure to steer those funding streams towards evidence-based work. And then also, like Michael Sean was saying, we can't have the scarcity mentality of, we'll take another $1 million, thank you so much. We need tens of millions more, if not hundreds of millions more dollars in these programs. So in California, it wasn't enough to say, let's go from 9 million to 10 million or 15 million. We asked for 39 million, and we've got up to 30, but we're just getting started, and we won't be happy until we're in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think we need to take that mentality to the rest of the country, that this work is so important and so valuable, and lives are on the line. At the last panel, we were talking about how street outreach workers are getting paid a minimum wage, or some are even working for free. And to me, it's outrageous, and they should be getting paid what they are contributing to our society, which is an incredible value that needs to be recognized and met in the pay that they're receiving. And part of making that happen is scaling up our state, local, and federal investments in this type of work. So that's where we're going, but it's going to take a lot more work.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, we talked about this at lunch, and we were at the same panel. It's a perfect place of where we're going next is to scale up the work. We have 2 additional precincts. Then we'll be citywide in Detroit. So this will be an overlay of a strategy that we do across the city. So we'll do that before the end of the summer, and then we will just work to increase capacity. We'll do professional development for our outreach workers and our resource counselors. We'll also work and take some best practices that we've heard here today, particularly from South Bend. He just left the room, but in trying to figure out how then we work with our providers to get some benefits for our street outreach workers. We're able to get them a few more dollars given the city increased our allotment, but continue to work towards that and to get them more dollars and invest to them for professional development, and then leverage resources, because there's other folks that we can partner with as we're doing now, but they have DOL dollars, they have DOJ dollars, state dollars, and then figure out how we can work together and leverage those resources. We'll add on a few more service providers. We've done a little bit work with housing, particularly around folks who are not traditionally homeless, but and fall under the CAM Council. I used to do the HUD work at the city, so we do work under the HUD guidelines for folks who are couch surfing. So we were able to garner some CSBG dollars and garner some dollars for housing, and then we'll do some legal services as well to help with folks with tickets and get them what they need and focus on basic needs. And so that's what we'll work on coming up soon.
I'll keep it very brief, but the team I talked about before, just a great team, and they're always looking at this work saying, how can we improve? How can we get better? A few things we're in the middle of. The first one I'm really excited about is incorporating social workers and case managers into every one of the 11 street outreach programs across the state. And Erica's here, and she's helping us lead that work. Something we're really excited about, badly needed both for the folks that our outreach workers are working with and also for the outreach teams themselves. On the kind of procedural justice side, we're looking at this concept of principled policing that Stockton talks about. We've invested in a lot of training on procedural justice. We've done some training around implicit bias. We haven't really had any of our sites really buy in on the reconciliation side, so looking moving forward at kind of this package of the principled policing and how we can move that piece of it forward. In terms of the training and institutionalization, we assist in doing the curriculum for the basic course for police officers for every police officer in the state other than NYPD and the state police. That basic curriculum will now include introduction to the principles around this type of work, so every new police officer, when they start the job, will at least have some understanding of what this type of work is all about, which I think is a huge improvement. So those are just some of the things that we've got cooking that we're working on.
Just some. Great. So we can open it up to questions from you all. I think we'll have a couple microphones floating around, so raise your hand and...
Hello, Jay Gilmer from Pittsburgh. The question for you guys is, has anyone tried to come up with a value for the lives not lost? For instance, if you have a plane crash, people are going to get a settlement of $3 million, $5 million, whatever. Anyone try to put a value on that as opposed to simply the dollars saved in incarceration or law enforcement costs and things like that? Looking at your return on investments.
We do work, it's not directly where you're talking, but Terry Salo's here, who heads our research team, been trained in this results first work, and we do try and cost out. So for example, a little bit off track, but when Raise the Age was taking place in New York here, we put together a proposal for funding, and in that proposal we tried to price out, if you invest this much money properly implementing Raise the Age and getting early intervention and getting the right interventions for the right people, this is how much it will cost you and this is how much it will save you going forward. So, we haven't done it to the extent you're talking about directly with homicides, but we do a lot of work around trying to price out what the cost of the intervention is and what your long-term savings will be if you make the right investments.
I would just add, we do a similar effort regarding any local advocacy. Part of the growth of our organization was the development of our research team, which is ever expanding. And right now, we're actually looking to onboard an economist to actually lead this sort of analysis and look at that specific sort of issue. But we do similar efforts on the local level, and we've done it, I believe, in Delaware, in some other places where we've identified what the gain would be for the city or the state as a part of our advocacy to get their support.
Hi there, Rory Gagan from Centre for Social Justice in the UK. A question certainly for gentlemen on the end. The court monitoring work, keen to hear a bit more about that. It sounds like a really positive way of getting the community kind of actually involved and holding the judiciary and some of the other authorities to account. Could you just sort of share a bit more about how that works?
I'll talk a little bit about the program, but I think Mike might also be able to add. So there are a number of states where when an individual is subject to a protective order during the ex parte phase, they must relinquish their firearm. In other states, it doesn't apply until a full order is actually issued after the ex parte phase. Regardless of where a state falls, the role of our program is to go into the courts, watch the judges, and make sure that they are requiring relinquishment when necessary. The way we do this is, and we're literally going to be doing a training next week in Nashville, is we train our moms, one, on the basics, how court works, what you'll be seeing, the different roles that are played within the courtroom. And then we go through the nuances of the decision-making process for a judge. We tell them the certain questions they should be asking, the certain questions they shouldn't be asking, right? We ask them to note the different decision points, any sort of behavior or commentary that might be added, whether there's been, whether the respondent was there, right? right? How long they waited before they dismissed the case if the respondent wasn't there. Did they ask the respondent whether or not he had a firearm? Did he say he had a firearm and was it ignored? Right? And we do this in a number of ways. One, there's a qualitative portion that I just described. The moms are going in the courts. But then internally, the quantitative portion is we then request the files from the court. And then we go through every court file for every case that we've observed, and we're now going to be doing an analysis and producing a report based on our experiences in Providence. The next level of that is then publicizing that and using this as a lever to get the change we need or to affirm that they're doing the right thing. Not to ruin the movie, but there's some things that could be, worked on. And that's going to be part of our process, not just going straight to the press, affording the court an opportunity to make some changes, engaging with local leadership and legislators. We have a lobbyist on the ground that's assisting us and helping us navigate the local waters, but then expanding elsewhere and making this more of a national movement. Now, we're not the first ones to do this. There are a number of court watch programs across the nation. And in fact, we have moms in Dallas who have already started their own program without a law on the books in Texas. And they went and found a judge who's willing to order relinquishment because he has the discretion to. So there are other opportunities and ways that programs like this can be implemented, even in states where they don't have the laws, but you have a judge that won't advocate from the bench, but will do what he's empowered to do and utilize his discretion with responsibility.
Just one real quick thing to add to that is even in states like California where we've passed an extreme risk protection order, and I think with Nevada just the other day we now have 14 states that have this policy in place. That's phenomenal growth for this policy 15, that has been shown to reduce suicides. We think also has impact on homicides. But what we saw in California was even after this had been passed, it wasn't being implemented with much frequency. And so there's a definite need, not just to pass the policy, but then to do the back end work of making sure that communities and judges and law enforcement officers, and basically every important stakeholder in this process is highly educated on how it works. And so we've been doing that in partnership with other groups to make sure that community members understand in a very basic way, what is an extreme risk protective order? How can I apply for one if I'm concerned about a family member? And then also educating judges about it, because folks that you would assume would just know don't. So I think that's an important part of the work, is to make sure folks know about what's out there.
Hi, I'm Michael too. So there's been some discussion in this panel, and certainly for the past couple days at the conference, on focusing on the most at-risk individuals, at risk of committing the most serious forms of violence. And I've been in this field a very long time, and I'm fine with that as long as we don't go in the direction of the super predator, which was a discussion we had in the 1990s, which only had deleterious effects. But that said, and there's also been discussion about wrapping around services and making services available to young people who identify who need some help in our most oppressed neighborhoods. So my question is, have you guys considered not funding services, but funding the young people who I would argue are the experts on violence? Certainly I've learned a lot from them in these very oppressed communities, to give them partnership status at the table to identify the problems that they're seeing, to help identify the dynamics that's driving the violence, and to work as partners in developing strategies to reduce violence and the conditions that promote it. And one example that you may know of from California is Youth for Justice. I know Youth Alive does some of the work. Youth for Justice is a true youth community organizing project. And one final thing about that, we know the characteristics of these kids who are living in these communities that are very oppressed, and the newest term we call for these kids is, and young adults, is marginalized, which they truly are, that if you talk with them, and I'm sure a lot of us have, nobody's ever told them what they've done right. they've told them what they've done wrong all their lives. And from a certain perspective, the aggressive acting out is a way to get attention and status, the only one they know. So to circle back, have you guys, or what are your thoughts about supporting youth community organizing efforts? And so one last thing on this. If you saw the picture in Hong Kong, those are young people who organized at great odds and great risk to argue against proposed change in law where they can be taken to China and prosecuted there. Those are young people. You can go back to SNCC and all kinds of civil rights movement where young people have been active, yet we're not looking to fund those youth movements now in relation to gun violence or other forms of serious violence.
Yes. So a large part of our membership is our Students Demand Action Initiative. And these are chapters across the nation populated by teenagers, college kids that are leading the way. They're doing their own programming. We support them with an online portal we call Gun Sense University Online. We pre-populate it with trainings, and we also listen to their needs, and we develop trainings for them. So that's a high-level macro answer to you. But I'll give you some specific examples. Right now, we're working closely with one of our SDA members in California. He's a current college student, but he's from Compton. And he came up with a program where he wants to take 10 kids from his community and introduce them to the gun violence prevention movement, engage directly with the local law enforcement as well as mayor, have them participate in advocacy efforts, sign making, visiting the Capitol House in Sacramento. Separately, we have a very young, talented, and inspired kid out of Baltimore who is leading the way in engaging with the police. He wants to develop a hub within his local church for all local chapters of SDA to meet, convene, share their experiences, plan, and program together. So those are two examples of how we're working hand in hand. And I would also be remiss if I didn't note, and I'm sure Mike will as well, that there are a number of kids out there who are well organized and are making a huge impact. A couple months ago, I was at the Peace MVP Awards in Massachusetts with David Hogg. He's a true leader, a strong voice, and not only was he a great conduit and messenger, but he elevated many of those in the room that no one had ever heard of. Kids who had walked miles in the snow to advocate for better gun laws. Kids who skipped class so that they could protest. Things of that nature. And there's so many kids out there, and I think you're right to point to them as truly the voice for the future, and it's necessary for us to support and invest in them so that they can do what we know they're capable of.
By the way, David's sister is 4 years younger, and she's going to be an amazing powerhouse, and eventually may outshine David. So I just want to give a shout out to the whole family.
Can't wait to meet them.
Not surprising to hear that. Agree with everything Michael Sean just said. I'll just add, I think when we're talking about youth, we have to be a little careful that we're not being too narrow and defining that in a too small of a way. Because in Oakland, one of the interesting takeaways from our report was that forever the city had said violence is a problem, as you heard from Reagan yesterday, a problem that's been driven by young people, right? We need to focus on the young people. When they did a problem analysis that showed the average age of perpetrator and victim was actually closer to 28 years old. So not to say young people are an absolute essential part of the solution and need to be lifted up. But I think there's a temptation, especially in the political world, to say, we're willing to fund things for young people, but then what are we doing about the highest risk folks that are, I would argue, are still very young? We're talking about people under the age of 30, but they're not necessarily children anymore. So that's just one caveat to that I would add. And I think programs like Advanced Peace, we heard from Devon Bogan yesterday, the city of Richmond has seen a tremendous reduction in gun violence, and I think part of what's worked there is they've engaged young people as actual partners in the work. It's a voluntary program. They aren't forced to participate, and there are paid stipends to remain engaged in the program, and as they meet certain milestones, continue to be paid for that work. That model has been adopted in Oakland, and I think more and more places are looking at that, because the reality is, if you're going to be joining in this work and we are actually valuing you as an equal partner, we need to show that and represent that. And I think nothing speaks louder than actually paying someone for their engagement with the work, and I think that's an important development from Oakland and Richmond.
I'll just add from a micro level in Detroit what we're doing, and I'd love to evolve to get to fund it. Our average age is 26. Every time we run a call-in, every time we run the average age of a homicide victim, it's always 26. So we have the exact same data. But we started doing, our outreach staff took it, they were called listening sessions, and they would fall opposite of our call-ins. And we'd sit in the audience, and the folks would come in, mostly men would come in, and they would talk to us, and they were fascinating, and we did a handful of them, and they'd call, they'd happen the month after we'd have the call-in, and instead of us just talking to them, and they listened to us, and so we would learn all sorts of things about how services and how to and meet them where they are and what they needed, and their view on police and their view on the community and their neighborhood, and some really incredible things happen, and out of those conversations. And so then where that evolved to is the brotherhood and the sisterhood work that we do. And we have a My Brother's Keeper grant for the brotherhood work, and then we got a Southwest Airlines grant for JetBlue. I knew I was going to get it wrong. JetBlue Airlines for the sisterhood work, and that funds this. And so we have 6 high schools citywide that we've targeted. 50. Cheryl Jones, that you all hopefully saw her get the award. She really leads this effort, the brotherhood and sisterhood effort, and her work in the schools. So 6 schools, 50 boys and 50 girls are the brotherhood and the sisterhood. They meet weekly. It's called What's Up Wednesday on the west side and Talk It Up Thursday on the east side. And they really evolved from these listening sessions. They got to be too big, so we drilled them down and had them based in the schools and work with and mentoring. And it's community driven. It's in the community, and it's very much youth focused. And they talk to us about what they want the subject matter and what they want. We provide haircuts and sporting event outings, and it's police and our outreach working together to do this mentoring and to do this work. We just did a prom send-off that our media got wind of, and it's not really what we'd hoped for, but it did go on earned media. But I'd love to get to a spot once we build capacity and we're able to fund this. And I love what Sasha said yesterday about the micro grants, and so that's a best practice that we're going to take from our Midwest colleagues in Minneapolis and start to fund for these entrepreneurial efforts, because folks want to be engaged in the economy, of course, and take care of their needs and their family, but yet are not connected to traditional funding sources. So that is definitely a best practice we're going to talk to and figure out how we can fund this, at least in a small way to start with.
One thing I'll add, there's nothing to do with your question, but goes back to Megan's last question, and I should have said it, was we're doing some, what I think is very exciting work, just starting a couple of pilot sites around non-fatal shootings and impunity.
Hi, my name's Matthew Goodrow. I'm a legislative analyst for the Bronx District Attorney's Office. The one thing that struck me is, especially the gentleman on the end, the national folks, was the legislatures that have invested in violence prevention versus the Florida legislature that invested all that money in hardening schools. Is obviously Democrats tend to control the New York, Illinois, California, the other places. So I'm just curious if there's been any success working with Republican-controlled legislatures or specific legislators, and perhaps if you've messaged differently with those folks, and if so, what the message has been.
One quick example that's very concrete is last year, Maryland, and a lot of us worked on this, passed a bill that created the Maryland Violence Intervention Program that allotted $10 million to go to the most impacted communities. So Baltimore, Prince George's County got the bulk of that money, which is great. And the Republican governor, Larry Hogan, signed that piece of legislation. So I think there's an example of bipartisan agreement on this type of work and some encouraging signs that this can be a bipartisan issue. I think the governor was pretty easily convinced in that case, but in general, I think the analogy is to criminal justice reform, right? And I think what won over a lot of conservatives on that issue was making this cost and benefit analysis, right? Like, set aside the moral issue of incarcerating so many people. This is costing an incredible, incredible amount of money for your state, and there's a better way forward. And I think those arguments resonate with conservatives, and we can make those same arguments here, that gun violence is costing an incredible amount of money. There are proven solutions out there, and your return on investment will be very high. And I think that gets through, and especially in light of the fact that now we're not talking about regulating guns. So we can at least have a conversation. We won't just be shown the door, which is the start to that. So I'm hoping that will now, in the next few years, we're talking about what's coming down in the future. I'm hoping we're going to see some purple and even red states start to make these investments and can show the way for other similar states that this is something they should be doing regardless of politics.
Yeah, I would also add, and this isn't directly related to funding, but we also see bipartisan support of extreme risk protection orders. So as was mentioned, Colorado just passed, and they're the 15th state, but it went through a Democratic House and a Republican Senate before it was actually affirmed and signed by the governor. So that's an example of further progress, and hopefully we'll see even more in the next year.
My boss is cringing right now. He's on the panel, but I'm not going to ask him a question. So I'm Mike Wood from the Division of Criminal Justice Services. I actually want to ask my national colleagues a question here. So in our GIVE programming, as I think you probably both know, we have partnerships, DAs, police, sheriffs, probation, prosecutors. I'm aware of the national group, Prosecutors Against Gun Violence, heavily legislative based on the national level. I understand that. We work closely with prosecutors. I think we're kind of moving the ball. We have people getting beyond some non-traditional work from the prosecution standpoint and making some success there, but it's an ongoing challenge. Obviously, they're heavily involved in GVI work as well and being at the table. But my question on the national level is all the work that your organizations are doing, are you working with prosecutors as well?
Another resounding yes. So we're working in a couple different places and in a couple different ways. We're working closely with the King County Prosecutor's Office and the Seattle City Attorney in Washington State, where they have a multi-agency coordinated effort to assure that guns are being removed from domestic violence abusers. It's a partnership with the Seattle PD, the King County Sheriff's Office. They have a very intentional approach to reviewing every case where a gun is supposed to be relinquished, as well as assuring that that happens. We're also engaged with the City Attorney's Office in San Diego. If you look at the stats in California, the vast majority of the ERPOs are being petitioned for and issued in San Diego County, LA County, Santa Barbara County, and in large part because law enforcement is so plugged in and they work in tandem with petitioners to make sure that those petitions are well written and are ultimately issued. So we're working to learn a little bit more from them. They have a statewide training program that we will be going out there and watching with them so we can hopefully replicate that elsewhere. And in addition, we're working with Suffolk County Prosecutor's Office to help them implement ERPO at the end of August. So August 24th, it becomes effective here in New York State. A number of prosecutors' offices as well as PDs are starting to try to figure out what this will require of them. In addition to police being able to petition for ERPOs, in New York State, they will be the first to allow school administrators as well. So we've been engaging with Suffolk County to start having those meetings with school districts and also develop some of the forms and strategies necessary. And lastly, we're working with the Dallas County Prosecutor's Office to replicate King County's model in Dallas. Although they don't have the law, because some of the judges are requiring relinquishment, they want to have a coordinated effort to make sure if they're going to get a judge to go out on a limb, that they actually go get that gun.
The only thing I'll add to that is at the federal level, a lot of grants for this type of work have been sort of cut and consolidated under Project Safe Neighborhoods. And Project Safe Neighborhoods, if you're not familiar with it, basically goes to U.S. attorneys' offices, and they have a ton of discretion in terms of how they're going to spend that money. So one of the sort of strategic entry points we've seen is, reaching out directly to USA offices to say, hey, if you're not familiar with GBI and some of these other strategies, you should be, and this is a potential way for you to be using this funding that's more targeted, more strategic, and we think a better use of that funding. So I think that's one specific way to engage with prosecutors at the federal level.
Okay, so I want to just thank our wonderful panelists for all of their great insights this afternoon. Thank you all for being with us and for your great questions. So let's give our panelists a round of applause. And next up is our closing conversation in the theater. So if you want to make your way down there, that'd be great. Thank you.